cauldrons bubbling with mysterious potions, black cats moving through moonlit shadows, women soaring through starlit skies on broomsticks. The witch, a figure that has haunted our imaginations for centuries. But what if everything you thought you knew about witches was deliberately twisted by those in power? What if I told you that a witch originally meant wise woman, healers, midwives and herbalists who were the backbone of their communities? These weren't evil hags casting curses. They were educated women who threatened the established order simply by existing. But something changed. Something so sinister that it transformed respected healers into public enemies. In just a few centuries, wise women became scapegoats for society's failures. Midwives who delivered babies, accused of stealing them. Herbalists who cured the sick, blamed for causing plagues. The witch trials weren't just about superstition. They were about power, control, and silencing those who dared to challenge authority. What followed was one of history's most horrible campaigns of terror, where knowledge became a crime, punishable by death. In this video, we're diving into the real history of witches, where healing hands were bound, wisdom was weaponized against the innocent, and entire communities turned neighbor against neighbor in a frenzy of fear and flames. The shadows of witchcraft stretch back through millennia, their origins buried in the very foundations of human civilization. To understand the true power behind these ancient practices, we must journey back over 4,000 years to ancient Mesopotamia, where the first whispers of magic echoed through the cradle of civilization itself. Deep within the dusty archives of history lies the Maklu series, a collection of clay tablets that reveals humanity's earliest documented battle against the forces of darkness. Dating back to the first millennium BCE, these weren't mere stories or superstitions. They were weapons, sacred incantations carved into clay, designed to combat the very real terror of malevolent witchcraft that plagued ancient societies. The Mesopotamians lived in constant fear of unseen enemies, practitioners of dark arts who could strike from the shadows without warning. To fight back, they called upon their most powerful deities, Ishtar, the fierce goddess of love and war, and Marduk, the mighty creator god. These tablets reveal a civilization gripped by supernatural dread, where the line between the living and the dead, between protection and destruction, was paper thin. But here's where it gets truly unsettling. The Mesopotamians perfected something called sympathetic magic, the terrifying belief that harming a doll, effigy, or personal belonging could inflict real suffering on a distant victim. Imagine the paranoia this created. A strand of your hair, a piece of your clothing, even your name scratched into clay could become instruments of your destruction in the wrong hands. Yet witchcraft in Mesopotamia wasn't purely malevolent. Ordinary people sought out local wise women and cunning men, practitioners who lived in the grey spaces between healer and hexcaster. These mysterious figures gathered herbs under moonlight, blessed stones with ancient power, and crafted protective charms that could mean the difference between life and death. The dead refused to stay buried. In Mesopotamian belief, spirits called Giddim wandered between worlds, influencing the living with their otherworldly desires. Families performed elaborate rituals to appease these restless souls, offering food and drink at household shrines, desperately hoping to earn protection rather than punishment from their deceased ancestors. Above them all, the stars themselves held sway. Astrologers known as Shumeru read the cosmic signs like a divine language, interpreting the movements of celestial bodies to predict everything from harvest success to personal doom. The heavens weren't distant and peaceful. They were a vast, watchful presence that could spell fortune or catastrophe with the shift of a single star. Perhaps most chilling of all was how deeply magic intertwined with healing. Mesopotamian practitioners blended herbal remedies with ritual incantations, understanding that true healing required more than medicine. It demanded communion with forces beyond the physical world. Disease wasn't just biological, it was spiritual warfare, and only those who understood both realms could hope to cure what afflicted the body and soul. These ancient Mesopotamians weren't primitive superstitionists. They were sophisticated practitioners of a complex magical system. that recognized the interconnectedness of all things, the living, the dead, the earthly, and the divine. Their elaborate death rituals and traditions would echo through countless cultures that followed, establishing patterns of belief that still persist, even to this very day. In the flickering candlelight of ancient temples and the whispered prayers of desperate families, we see the true birth of witchcraft, not as fantasy or folklore, but as humanity's earliest attempt to understand and control the terrifying mysteries that surrounded them. In the darkness, deep in the mist-covered lands of ancient Europe, where stone circles stood as silent witnesses to forgotten rituals, another civilization was weaving its own dark tapestry around those who wielded power beyond the ordinary world. Welcome to the Celtic territories, where the boundary between the seen and the unseen was as fragile as morning frost. Here, in these windswept highlands and shadowed forests, witches weren't outcasts lurking at the edges of society. They were the beating heart of their communities, the keepers of secrets that determined whether families lived or died through the brutal winters ahead. These practitioners moved through their world like living bridges between realms, their very existence, proof that some knowledge was too dangerous for ordinary minds to grasp. The Celtic wheel of the year turned on 4 sacred festivals, each one a doorway where witches stepped forward to guide their people through life's most treacherous passages. These weren't mere celebrations, they were survival rituals disguised as festivals, and the fate of entire communities hung in the balance. When October 31st arrived, the festival of Samhain cast its shadow across the land, and this was no innocent harvest celebration. On this night, the barrier separating the living from the dead dissolved like smoke. Celtic witches knew what others feared to acknowledge, that death was never the end, merely a transition. As darkness fell, they became humanity's last line of defense against spirits that hungered to reclaim what they'd lost in life. Their knowledge of protective herbs, of rituals passed down through centuries, meant the difference between a community that survived the haunted season and one that fell prey to forces far beyond mortal comprehension. When February first brought Imbolc, these same practitioners channeled powers that could either give hope or extinguish it forever. They honored Brigid, the goddess whose flames could heal or destroy with equal ease. In their hands, candles became weapons against the suffocating darkness, and the crosses they crafted, they weren't just symbols, they were shields, woven from ancient magic, protecting homes from malevolent forces that prowled the frozen wasteland outside. As May 1st ushered in Beltane, the witches revealed their most intoxicating power, the ability to awaken life itself. They led communities in rituals so primal, so charged with raw fertility magic, that crops would flourish or wither based on the strength of their invocations. The maypole dances, they weren't innocent folk traditions. They were acts of sympathetic magic, weaving human desires into the very fabric of nature. Their bonfires didn't just celebrate the sun's return, they commanded it, ensuring the light would grow stronger with each passing day. Finally, when August first brought Lughnasadh, these guardians of ancient wisdom stood at the crossroads between abundance and famine. Their rituals to honor the god La weren't mere ceremonies, they were negotiations with forces that controlled whether communities would feast or starve in the months ahead. The first fruits offered, they weren't just gifts, they were payments in a cosmic contract that kept the natural order in balance. But as centuries rolled forward, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon, this sacred relationship between witches and their communities began to crack. The very people who once depended on these practitioners for survival would soon view them through eyes clouded by fear and suspicion. The keepers of ancient wisdom were about to become the hunted, and their knowledge, it would transform from salvation into a death sentence. Our next chapter pulls us into the humid, shadow-drenched world of the Caribbean, where something profound was taking shape in the darkness of colonization. When the first slave ships arrived in the 16th century, they carried more than human cargo. Hidden in the hearts and minds of the enslaved were ancient spiritual traditions that would refuse to die, no matter how brutally their captors tried to erase them. What emerged from this collision of worlds wasn't just another religion, it was an act of spiritual rebellion. Voodoo, became the underground railroad of the soul, a way for the oppressed to maintain their connection to the divine while appearing to submit to their master's Christian God. At its core, voodoo recognizes Bondi, the supreme creator, who remains distant and unreachable. But here's where it gets fascinating. Practitioners don't worship Bondi directly. Instead, they commune with the powerful spirits with distinct personalities and domains. These aren't demons or devils, despite what Hollywood wants you to believe. They're intermediaries, spirits of love, war, agriculture, and healing, who bridge the gap between the earthly and the divine. The rituals themselves are electric with spiritual energy, drum beats that seem to pulse with the heartbeat of the earth, dancing that becomes a gateway between worlds. And then comes the possession, moments when a LWA takes control of a devotee, speaking ancient wisdom through human lips. To outsiders, it looks terrifying. To believers, it's the most sacred form of communication possible. But here's what they don't want you to know. Voodoo has been deliberately demonized by Western media for centuries. Why? Because a religion that empowers the oppressed, that teaches spiritual self-reliance, that celebrates the interconnectedness of all living things, that's dangerous to those who profit from division and control. At its heart, voodoo isn't about curses or black magic. It's about healing, community, and the unbreakable human spirit refusing to be crushed. As we leave behind the vibrant ritualistic world of voodoo and Caribbean witches, we journey back in time to medieval Europe, where a different kind of witchcraft tale unfolds, a tale soaked in blood, terror, and the systematic slaughter that would become one of humanity's darkest chapters. Picture this, medieval Europe, where fear crawled through every village like a living thing. This wasn't just superstition. This was weaponized terror. The witch hunts of the 15th to 17th centuries didn't happen by accident. They were born from a twisted marriage of religious fanaticism, social collapse, and the church's desperate hunger for control. The Catholic Church didn't just condemn witchcraft, they declared war on it. Christian doctrine branded witches as Satan's soldiers, threatening the very foundation of society. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. Burning wasn't just execution, it was spiritual warfare. The church believed flames would purify the soul and obliterate the body so completely that even the devil couldn't claim what remained. They were literally trying to erase people from existence itself. Enter the most dangerous book you've never heard of, the Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. This wasn't just a manual, it was a blueprint for genocide. Translated as Hammer of Witches, it provided step-by-step instructions for identifying, prosecuting, and executing suspected witches. This book became the witch hunter's Bible, spreading across Europe like a virus of violence. But here's the horrifying truth. Witchcraft became the perfect scapegoat. Crop failure, blame the witch. Disease outbreak, the witch did it. Economic collapse, must be witchcraft. Society needed someone to blame for their suffering. And the most vulnerable, women, the elderly, the poor, became targets. The trials themselves were theaters of torture. Confessions weren't extracted through justice, they were carved out through agony. Between the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the killing reached its peak. Conservative estimates put the death toll between 40,000 and 60,000 souls. But some historians believe the true number climbed as high as 100,000. Germany, Switzerland, and France became killing fields, where entire communities turned against their own neighbors. The madness only ended when skepticism finally pierced through the darkness. The Enlightenment brought scientific reasoning and legal reform, challenging centuries of superstition. By the late 17th century, the witch hunts finally died out, but the scars they left on European consciousness would never fully heal. The legacy remained, etched in blood and memory, a reminder of what happens when fear becomes law and suspicion turns deadly. By the late 17th century, that legacy of fear had crossed the Atlantic like a plague, taking root in the New World with devastating consequences. In the bitter winter of 1692, Salem, Massachusetts, became a powder keg of terror and suspicion. The Puritans lived in a world they believed was literally torn between heaven and hell, a cosmic battlefield where witchcraft served as undeniable proof of Satan's growing influence. But Salem wasn't just about supernatural fears. Social tensions simmered beneath the surface, like a pot ready to boil over. Land disputes, economic struggles, bitter rivalries between neighbors, all of it created the perfect storm when young girls, including 9-year-old Betty Paris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams, began exhibiting terrifying symptoms. The community found its scapegoat, with children writhing on the floor, screaming as if possessed, their bodies contorting in ways that defied explanation. When the local doctor, William Griggs, couldn't find a medical cause, he delivered a diagnosis that would seal the fate of dozens. The evil hand is upon them. The girls' accusations fell on 3 women who embodied society's most vulnerable: Tituba, an enslaved Caribbean woman; Sarah Good, a homeless beggar who wandered door to door; and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman entangled in bitter land disputes. Under brutal interrogation, Tituba confessed, not to save herself, but because she understood that survival meant feeding the beast of paranoia. Her confession didn't just admit guilt, it promised that more witches lurked in the shadows. What followed was a cascade of terror. Neighbors who'd feuded for years suddenly had the perfect weapon. The accused faced an impossible choice: confess and drag others into the nightmare, or maintain innocence and face the gallows. The court of Oya and Termina, literally meaning to hear and determine, relied heavily on spectral evidence, where accusers claimed to witness the spirits of the accused tormenting them in dreams and visions. The numbers tell a chilling story. Over 200 people accused, 30 found guilty, 19 executed by hanging, and 5 died in the squalor of jail cells. Then there was Giles Corey, the 80-year-old farmer who refused to enter a plea. For 2 days, authorities piled heavy stones on his chest, slowly crushing him to death. His final words: more weight. But the madness couldn't sustain itself forever. By October 1692, when accusations began reaching the wives of prominent ministers and government officials, Governor William Phipps dissolved the court. Spectral evidence was banned, and by May 1693, the remaining 150 prisoners walked free. In 1702, the General Court declared the trials unlawful. Today, Salem serves as more than a tourist destination. It's a monument to how quickly fear can consume a community. The Proctor's Ledge Memorial marks the execution site, while the names of the innocent are etched in stone. Yet perhaps the most haunting reminder came as recently as 2022, when Elizabeth Johnson Jr. was finally exonerated, 329 years after her conviction. Some wounds, it seems, take centuries to heal. As the centuries rolled forward, something profound began stirring in the shadows of human consciousness. The late 18th and early 19th centuries ushered in the Romantic period, an era that would fundamentally reshape how people viewed the mystical and the unknown. But this wasn't just an artistic movement. It was a rebellion against the cold rationality of the Enlightenment, a desperate hunger for something deeper, something that science couldn't explain away. The world was changing rapidly. Industrial machines were replacing human hands, cities were swallowing the countryside, and traditional ways of life crumbling. In response, people turned inward, seeking magic in a world that felt increasingly mechanical. Occultism and spiritualism didn't just emerge. They exploded into mainstream consciousness, like water rushing into a void. Secret societies flourished in this atmosphere of mystical yearning. The Theosophical Society, founded in 1875, promised ancient wisdom and hidden truths. These weren't fringe groups meeting in dusty basements. They attracted intellectuals, artists, influential thinkers who believed that conventional religion had lost its power to explain life's deepest mysteries. The creative minds of this era: Edgar Allan Poe, with his tales of death and resurrection; Mary Shelley, breathing life into corpses; Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, exploring deals with the devil. They weren't just writing fiction, they were channeling something darker, more primal. William Blake spoke with angels and demons as if they were neighbors. Caspar David Friedrich painted landscapes where the divine seemed to lurk, behind every twisted tree, every fog-shrouded mountain. But perhaps most telling was the rise of spiritualism. Seances became social events where grieving families gathered around tables, desperately hoping to hear whispers from beyond the grave. Mediums promised what religion could no longer guarantee: direct, personal contact with the dead. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a society trying to reconnect with the forces that rationalism had tried to bury. This romantic hunger for the mystical didn't just influence art and literature, it planted seeds that would eventually bloom into the modern witchcraft revival. When people began questioning everything their ancestors had been taught to fear, they were unknowingly laying the foundation for witchcraft's return to mainstream acceptance. In the shadows of our modern world, something ancient awakens. A revival stirs, pulling people back to earth-centered spirituality and forgotten wisdom. This is the neo-pagan revival, a movement that reaches deep into Celtic, Norse, Greek, and other mythologies, honoring nature, divinity, and the sacred balance between feminine and masculine forces. At the heart of this resurgence lies Wicca, established in the mid-20th century as one of the most recognized forms of modern witchcraft. But this isn't the Hollywood version of spell casting you might expect. Wicca is duotheistic, centered on the worship of both a goddess and a god. The goddess manifests as the triple goddess, maiden, mother, and crone, representing the eternal cycles of life and the moon's shifting phases. The god appears as the horned god, connected to fertility, wildlife, the sun, forests, and the turning of seasons. Wiccans follow the wheel of the year, celebrating 8 seasonal festivals called Sabbats, marking agricultural and solar cycles. They also observe Esbats, lunar rituals that honor the goddess when she's at her most powerful. Their ceremonies involve casting sacred circles, invoking the elemental forces of earth, air, fire, and water, and seeking divine guidance through ancient practices. But Wicca is just one thread in a much larger tapestry. Modern pagans include druids, heathens, eclectic pagans, and countless others, all reviving pre-Christian spirituality that was nearly erased from history. Their practices often embrace shamanism, spirit communication, animism, and honoring ancestral lineage, connecting with powers mainstream society has long forgotten or feared. Yet here's what's disturbing. Despite centuries of evolution and deeper understanding, the same negative stereotypes persist, like a curse that won't break. Popular media still portrays witches as villains dabbling in dark magic, twisting the truth that many modern practitioners use their craft for healing, protection, and spiritual growth. It seems some fears run so deep that even truth cannot fully dispel them. As we reach the end of our story, one truth emerges from the shadows. The dark history of witches isn't simply a chapter from humanity's brutal past. It's a mirror, reflecting our deepest fears about power, knowledge, and those who dare to exist outside society's carefully drawn lines. The witch trials, they weren't really about witchcraft. They were about control, about silencing voices that threatened the established order, about transforming healers into heretics, midwives into monsters, and independent women into cautionary tales. The real magic wasn't in their supposed spells, but in how easily entire communities could be convinced to destroy their neighbors. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is this: the forces that created these witch hunts, fear of the other, the need to find someone to blame, the comfort of Moby mentality, they haven't disappeared. They've just found new forms, new targets, new ways to manifest in our modern world. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the shadows. If you've made it this far and found yourself drawn into these dark histories, please leave a like. It helps others discover these buried stories. Subscribe to become part of our growing community of the curious, those who aren't afraid to look beneath the surface. What other historical events do you think have been sanitized or forgotten? Which stories from the past deserve to be unearthed and examined in their full, uncomfortable truth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The past has a way of repeating itself, especially when we choose to forget its lessons. Perhaps that's why the darkest tales are always buried